My name is Evan Cross. I am 48 years old, a senior operations data analyst at Redstone Maritime Logistics. For the past 20 years, every single morning of mine has started the same way, walking along the Savannah docks while the sun is still half asleep. People like to talk about Savannah's old world charm, but the only thing I ever remember is the sound of steel hitting steel, the cranes groaning like metal lungs exhaling, and the waves slapping against the hulls as if reminding us this job has never been gentle. The air is always salty. The early wind carries the cold off the river and the smell of engine oil. I have grown so used to it that it feels like home. Others hear noise. I hear the heartbeat of the port. There is one thing I always keep in my jacket pocket. My old pocket watch, its lid faded, its edge a little scratched, but still ticking right on the second. It belonged to my father, a sailor who spent his entire life drifting across the ocean. He taught me that time and honor are the only two things you cannot get back once you lose them. I am not sentimental, not really, but every time I touch that watch, it feels like he is standing right behind me, reminding me to hold my ground. I carried it with me this morning like always, though I swear it felt just a little heavier. Today marks my 20th year at Redstone Maritime Logistics. People sometimes ask, what is so admirable about staying in one company for 2 decades? I just laugh. Not everyone needs glory and change. Some of us find our peace in stability. I am one of those people. In 20 years, I have never been written up, never been late, never misplaced a single report. And yet, when I walked into the office this morning, the very first thing I received was nothing. No congratulations, no sticky note on my desk, not even a nod of acknowledgement. Just the soft hum of a printer somewhere in the distance and the cold, busy rhythm of people wrapped up in their own worlds. I was not hoping for fireworks or a cake, but if someone had dropped a cheap donut on my desk, I think I would have smiled. I simply thought that 20 years deserved at least one word of recognition, but no one said anything. People scrolled their mice, opened emails, poured coffee, and rushed past each other like ghosts. I stood there for a few seconds, then sat down like any other day, adjusted the pocket watch inside my coat, and reminded myself that quiet does not always mean meaningless. At 8 sharp, the Monday meeting started. I walked into the familiar conference room, the long, pale wood table, the oversized screen mounted on the wall. The air conditioning always made the place feel like it was covered in a thin layer of frost. Rick Halden, my direct supervisor, stood at the head of the table holding a coffee cup so large I always joked he could store his entire soul in it if he wanted. Rick opened the meeting like he did every week, loud, confident, just a little theatrical. Sitting in his meetings always felt like watching a man rehearse a speech in front of a mirror. Rick went on and on about shipping schedules, a new contract with a small carrier, then somehow jumped to the budget being a few line items short. I sat there, took a slow breath, waited to hear something, anything, close to a congratulations. But nothing. No mention of the 2 decades I had spent keeping the system running without a single misstep. Not one person in that room looked at me for more than 3 seconds. I felt a strange mix of disappointment and amusement. I was not asking for fireworks. A donut would have been fine. But even the donut was too much to ask today. Then I realized something else was wrong. Not about my anniversary. People here are better at forgetting than remembering. And after 20 years, I know that well. It was the air itself. A strange tension is floating between us. A few faces looked like they were hiding something. It reminded me of the smell of rain before a storm. No one says a thing, but everyone feels it. A strange silence was tucked between Rick's booming sentences. I lifted my eyes toward the large glass window. Morning light filtered in, thin and soft. It was not bright, just enough to coat the room in a muted gold, like a quiet reminder. Almost a signal that only someone who had spent years in this place would notice. I felt it clearly. Today was not going to be ordinary. Before I go on, I truly want to know what state you are watching from. I am from Georgia. What about you? Just then, a streak of sunlight landed on the table in front of me. I glanced at it, then reached for my pocket watch again. For some reason, I had the unsettling feeling that the light was warning me about something my mind had not processed yet. but my heart felt it plainly. Today was going to be longer than every day before it, and it might change things I thought would last forever. I was still watching that thin line of sunlight slide across the table when Rick suddenly changed his tone, sounding excited in a way he usually reserved for announcing some so-called breakthrough in maritime logistics. He set his oversized coffee cup down, rubbed his hands together, and flashed the kind of smile he only used in two situations. One, when he was about to shift the blame onto someone else. Two, when he was about to introduce a person whom no one had asked for. Today was clearly the second. Rick said we were getting new support, someone full of potential, someone with a different perspective, someone who would bring a fresh breeze to the department. The more he spoke, the more those words sounded like they were pulled straight from a handbook for managers who like speaking in vague optimism to hide the fact that they had absolutely no plan. I almost kept quiet, but Rick's smile made my stomach tighten. It was the smile of a man trying to convince himself that everything was going exactly as he hoped. The conference room door swung open. A man around 35 walked in with a confidence that did not belong to the situation. Crisp white shirt, ironed so sharply it caught the light. Beige khaki pants, polished leather shoes. Far too formal for a role Rick called shadowing operations. But what caught my eye even more was that his hands were completely empty. No laptop, no small notebook, no pen, nothing a person preparing to learn a system as complex as Redstone's should carry. Rick clapped once in delight and said, "This is Caleb Turner, an old friend of mine." I looked at Rick, then at Caleb, then back at Rick. Old friend sounded respectable, but everyone in that room knew what it really meant. Drinking buddy. People usually avoided saying such things out loud when introducing new personnel, but Rick announced it proudly, as if bonding over cheap whiskey near the docks was a qualification worthy of handling millions of dollars of cargo each month. Caleb smiled too widely, the kind of smile worn by someone absolutely certain they were being handed an opportunity they did not need to earn. He nodded at everyone, not knowing anyone's name and clearly not caring. When his eyes landed on me, I nodded back politely. In that brief moment, I recognized the look of a man trying to figure out whether I mattered, whether he needed to remember my face. I had met many people like him, more than enough. Rick continued, "Caleb will be shadowing the operations team for a while. Everyone help him out." I almost laughed. Everyone meant me. Rick never hid the fact that he intended to hand off every new hire to me, even when that new hire had likely never opened Excel in his life. Caleb took the empty seat beside me. That chair had always stayed open, but today it felt occupied in the worst way. He placed both hands on the table like he was preparing to sign a $1 million contract. I looked at his spotless white sleeve and wondered how long it would stay that color in an office where people handled data coated in steel dust and engine oil. Only a few minutes passed before Caleb turned to me with a legendary question. "Can you show me how to open Excel?" He pronounced it Excel, dragging the last syllable like he was describing a discounted item. I stared at him, trying not to let my expression betray me. Rick's eye twitched, but he pretended not to hear a thing. I pressed my lips together and answered in a voice soft as a passing breeze. I did not think Excel was a difficult word. Caleb laughed, assuming I was joking. I was not. I opened Excel for him, showed him the shortcut, how to create a new file, and how to save a document. He nodded confidently, as if he had already mastered an entire program I had spent nearly 10 years customizing with my own macros. I had not even taken a full breath when he clicked on last week's shipping data. 2 seconds later, I heard a long click. Part of his screen turned white. He had accidentally deleted the container tracking sheet, a sheet that had taken me 4 hours to update the night before, after a ship arrived later than scheduled. I felt my blood stop for half a beat. I turned to Caleb. He looked up with an awkward smile. "Oops." My hand slipped. Before I could react, Rick interrupted. "It is fine. Everyone has a first day." I looked at Rick, then at Caleb, and in that moment, one sentence rang in my head clearer than any sound on the docks. This is not the first day. This is the start of chaos. Rick kept running the meeting as if deleting critical data was completely ordinary. Caleb kept nodding, understanding nothing but looking very impressed with himself. And I, for the first time, felt a danger I had never faced before. The most dangerous people are not the incompetent. The most dangerous are the incompetent who hold influence. And Caleb Turner, standing in the middle of that room, was proof of that. I touched the pocket watch my father left me. The second hand still ticked steadily, but time around me felt as if it had shifted off balance. I did not know how far this would go, but I knew one thing for certain. Caleb's arrival was no coincidence. And that conference room on that morning, even though no one said a word, had truly changed color. A dull gray, heavy, and full of warning. I was used to training new people, but Caleb was not the kind of newcomer I had ever dealt with. The people before him, no matter how little experience they had, carried a basic sense of caution when working with a maritime logistics system. They understood that one wrong click did not just affect a spreadsheet. It could delay an entire ship, disrupt an entire route, and cost the supply chain far more than anyone wanted to admit. Caleb was different. He walked into the system the way someone plays a game on a phone, tapping every button he could find, mowing without thinking about the consequences. What worried me most was that Rick saw it as enthusiasm. 2 days after that meeting, I found the first sign of trouble. While checking user access rights in the operations system, I noticed Caleb's name listed under a high privilege group that even some senior staff did not have. I had to look 3 times to be sure I was not seeing things. Real-time container visibility, manifest editing privileges, access to port coordination boards, permission to view sensitive cargo categories. I turned the screen off and on again. His name was still there, sitting at the top of a list meant only for people with at least 10 years of experience. I could not remember the last time a chill ran down my spine like that. A new hire who had not made it through a full week, who did not know how to open Excel, now had more access than fully trained operations staff. That was not an accident. No one grants permissions like that by mistake. It required 3 levels of managerial approval. And if those rights existed, someone had intentionally put them there. I did not want to guess the name, but the answer was obvious. That same afternoon, I found the second sign. When I opened my inbox to review reports, I saw that Caleb had been copied into the internal email thread for a major client's shipping contract. It was a thread I had only been added to after years of handling critical data. No one explained why he was there. No introduction, no assigned role. His name was simply present, as if everyone had silently agreed he belonged to the group. I stared at the screen for a long moment, trying to find logic. There was none. And the lack of logic was the part that unsettled me the most. Then Caleb caused a real incident. Thursday morning, the moment I set my coffee on the desk, the system triggered a soft alarm. The manifest tracker for the Japan route displayed a red warning. I always check from the top down, from container lists to attached documents, and when I reached item 12 on the manifest, something was off. One attachment had the wrong name, and when I opened it, I understood why. Caleb had sent the manifest for a European route into the Japanese partner system. A small mistake on paper, but serious enough that the entire ship had to remain docked for 18 hours while the documents were re-verified. In maritime logistics, 18 hours can cost more than a month of an employee's salary. Our Japanese partner called my office directly, their voice polite but tight with frustration, asking why the container codes did not match previous documents. I turned toward Caleb's desk. He was leaning back in his chair, leg bouncing, typing something on his phone. When I asked him about it, he looked up and smiled lightly, as if he had printed the wrong form instead of delaying a multi-million-dollar ship. I thought that was the right file, he said. They looked the same. I had no answer for that. I opened the system and began checking every line, every code, every attachment. I stayed until nightfall, then long after the office went quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning and the sound of my own keyboard. I rebuilt the entire manifest, prepared explanations for the partner, wrote a risk report, adjusted the shipping schedule, and drafted the internal incident summary. When I finally shut my computer down, my father's watch showed 2:30 in the morning. I walked out of the office with footsteps heavy as steel. The next morning, Rick met Caleb in the hallway. I stood close enough to hear the sentence that still does not make sense to me. Caleb, you had the guts to try that. I like that spirit. What spirit? The spirit of putting a vessel at risk of violating an international contract. I just stood there watching Rick pat Caleb on the shoulder as if he had invented new technology. I could not tell if Rick truly did not understand or if he chose not to. Either answer was dangerous. Later that noon, while I was pouring coffee, Hannah from Internal Audit walked in. Hannah was not the type to talk much, but whenever she spoke, there was always a reason. She looked at me, then at the window where Rick and Caleb were talking, then asked a question that sounded half joking and half warning. Have you heard? There is an internal review this week. I set my cup down. I have not seen any announcement. Maybe they do not want people to know yet, she said, but I think you should prepare. She did not mean harm. It felt like a warning. She walked away as if she had not said anything at all, leaving me with the feeling that something was moving beneath the surface, something strong and hidden, like a current under the river. I returned to my desk and woke the screen. My father's pocket watch was in my jacket. I took it out and flipped it open. The second hand was still steady. My father used to tell me that you can lose your title, lose your money, but never lose your honor. I had heard that sentence my whole childhood. But today it sounded different, sharper, urgent, as if it was not just advice, but a warning meant for the moment I was standing in. I opened a new file, titled it Irregularities, then began writing everything down: the unreasonable access, the unexplained email threads, the manifest error, the hints of a power shift. And as I typed the first line, I realized this was no longer a hunch. It was the truth revealing itself piece by piece. I woke up the next morning with the uneasy sense that I had stepped into a different stage, one where every move needed sharper calculation. Caleb's excessive access, his presence in sensitive email threads, and the manifest mistake that kept the Japanese ship docked for nearly a full day, none of it could be treated as a coincidence anymore. I needed to hear Rick explain it, at least once, to know exactly what I was dealing with. That afternoon, I knocked and stepped into Rick's office. He looked up and gave me the kind of polite smile people use when they already know what the conversation is about and have a rehearsed, empty answer waiting. I want to talk about Caleb, I said. He has access far beyond what any new hire should have, and he is being copied into emails that require strict control. What exactly is his role? Rick's smile thinned, then shifted into something between annoyance and caution. He turned his chair, crossed his arms. Evan, he said, you seem a little too sensitive about this. I am asking reasonable questions. He stared at me for a few seconds, then switched to that soft, misleading tone he used whenever he wanted to dodge. Caleb is a new resource. I want him to see the full picture, maybe bring in a fresh perspective. We want innovation. Innovation still needs principles, I replied, and a new hire cannot test the system by sending live data to international partners. Rick tilted his head and raised his eyebrows. You are bringing that up again. Evan, everyone makes mistakes. Honestly, you have been a bit slow lately. Maybe being here so long is making it hard for you to adapt. I knew exactly what that meant. It was not feedback. It was a signal. Rick's bluntness did not shock me. It clarified things. He was not answering my question. He was attacking me to divert me away from it. I am not against change, I said. I am against giving power to the wrong person. Rick stood up, signaling the conversation was over on his terms. Evan, focus on your work. Do not worry about things outside your scope. I walked out with the unmistakable feeling that my position was being prepared for replacement, and Rick was no longer trying to hide it. In the days that followed, Caleb's attitude shifted faster than I expected. He no longer carried the hesitance of a new hire. Instead, he radiated the kind of misplaced confidence only people protected by someone above them ever have. One afternoon, while I was reviewing inventory data, Caleb leaned on the partition beside my desk. Evan, he said with a hint of bragging, do you think one day I will be sitting in this seat? I looked up at him. I think anyone who wants to sit anywhere should know what they are doing before trying to replace someone who already does it well. Caleb's smile faltered for half a second before returning. But I had already seen the small truth in his eyes. Rick had planted the idea of my job into his head. From that moment on, I knew my suspicions were no longer theories. They were a timeline already unfolding. I began collecting documentation systematically. I logged the system every time Caleb made irregular changes. I saved Rick's emails down playing incidents. I created a list of incorrect permissions, incorrect actions, and every moment the system alerted us. I did it all in silence. No complaining, no sharing, no frustration. Because if someone was building a narrative about me, I needed a narrative of my own. One with timestamps, data, and facts. Then the event that turned suspicions into solid evidence arrived in the most ridiculous way possible, through a misdirected email. Late that night, the office lights were low. I was about to shut my computer down when a new email popped up. Sender, Caleb Turner. The subject line was short. Role plan. I opened it. Inside was a thread between Caleb and Rick. I read it once, then again, and again, still unable to believe the words staring back at me. Caleb asked, "When do you think we can officially transition Evan's role?" Rick replied, "We need one or two more mistakes to justify it. I will handle the rest. Just get more involved." That sentence sealed it. Nothing was accidental. Nothing was minor. Everything was part of a plan Rick had already set in motion. And Caleb had accidentally sent it straight to me instead of to Rick. I sat still for a few seconds. No anger, no panic, just clarity. So clear that the first thing I did was save the original and export the entire thread as a PDF. That night I went home, opened my father's pocket watch, set it on the table and watched the second hand move. I thought about what he used to tell me. You can lose your title, lose your money, but never lose your honor. I opened my laptop and created a new folder. Its name was simple, but it carried more weight than any report I had ever compiled. The watch file. From that moment on, I was no longer documenting mistakes. I was documenting the truth. And the truth does not know how to lie. Friday night, while I was gathering files for the watch file, my work inbox chimed. I glanced at the screen and saw an email from Rick, sent at 8:47 in the evening. The subject line was so short it felt abrasive. Meeting, Monday, 9 a.m. No message, no context, no one was included except him and me. In the corporate world, an empty Friday night email usually means one of two things. Either it is a real emergency or something unpleasant is waiting on the other side. And after everything that happened that week, the second option was almost guaranteed. I read the email again, then removed it from my main inbox and stored it in my private folder. Another piece of the puzzle, but not one that made the picture any harder to read. I knew what was coming. The question was no longer if, but when. Monday morning, I arrived earlier than usual. Savannah's port was still quiet, only a few cranes beginning to move, and the distant horn of a ship breaking through the air. I had always liked mornings like that. They reminded me that no matter how much chaos people created, time would continue at its own pace. Just like the pocket watch my father left me. The second hand stayed honest, steady, unfazed by whatever people tried to alter. When I stepped into the conference room at Bicesh, I placed the watch on the table beside my folder. It felt like a reminder to myself. I was not entering that meeting to be directed. I was there to close a chapter on my own terms. Morning light came through the window and glinted off the watch's face. I touched it lightly, and the cold metal sharpened my focus. Rick arrived at 9 on the dot. Caleb walked in right behind him, wearing the kind of confidence that made him look like he owned the room. Rick sat at the head of the table, set his oversized coffee cup down, and looked at me as if gearing up for a speech. "Thank you for being on time, Evan," Rick said, sounding polite enough to be fake. "I am not in the habit of being late," I replied. Rick gave a thin smile, then exhaled as if preparing to deliver an important announcement. He placed his hands together, lacing his fingers like someone performing seriousness rather than feeling it. "We have reviewed the structure of this department," he began. "And I realize we need someone with a new perspective, new thinking, and new energy. New thinking, a phrase managers used when they wanted to hide the real reason behind a decision, vague enough that no one could fight it. So Rick continued, "As of today, Caleb will take on the role of Director of Strategic Operations." Caleb's face lit up with the same triumphant glow I had seen in people who believed they had won a competition they were never qualified to enter. I stayed quiet for a few seconds, not shocked, not upset. In fact, I felt strangely light. Light in the way a person feels after finally setting down something they have carried too long. Rick kept talking, even though no one asked him to. Caleb brings the new boimon, thinking this department needs. He will offer a different direction. A different direction. A perfect phrase for a decision with no foundation. I looked at Rick, then at Caleb, then allowed myself a small, calm smile, just enough to make both of them uneasy. All right, I said slowly, because the truth is I have been looking for a new direction too. Rick narrowed his eyes. What do you mean? I brought my resignation with me, I said, and I think now is the right time to hand it in. Caleb turned to Rick, startled. Rick immediately lost his composure. He leaned forward, voice raised. You cannot make that kind of decision right now. Evan, sit down. We need to have a serious conversation. I am already being serious, I replied. I see no reason to stay in a system where the truth is not valued. Rick slammed his hand on the table, completely losing control. Evan, do not act childish. If you walk out now, you are making things worse. I looked him straight in the eye, my voice low and sharp like a blade gliding through water. I am not the loudest person in this room, but I do have a good memory, and sometimes a good memory is more useful than shouting. The room fell into silence. Rick stared at me with a blend of anger and fear. Caleb sat frozen, unsure whether he had just won or lost. As for me, I felt a clarity I had not tasted in years. I stood. I set my resignation on the table beside Rick's untouched coffee. Then I picked up my father's watch, slipped it into my coat, and buttoned it neatly. I wish you both luck, I said. You will need it someday. Rick opened his mouth to say something else, but I did not give him the chance. I left the conference room with the calmest steps I could recall. I did not look back. There was no need. Some meetings do not require hearing the final line to know the ending. And that morning, when the door closed behind me, I knew I was leaving at the right moment. Not because I lost, but I refused to keep playing a game that had been rigged long before I entered the room. I walked out of the Redstone Maritime Logistics building with my resignation letter, still bearing the faint imprint of Rick's hand on the edge of the paper. The Savannah sky stretched open above me. So blue it felt almost cold. Wind rushed in from the river carrying the sharp scent of salt and the metallic clang of containers being lifted and set down. Part of me knew I had just stepped away from 20 years of work in the span of a single closing door. Another part of me felt lighter than I had in a very long time. I walked along the docks, my shoes tapping against concrete still damp with morning dew. Massive ships stood in long rows, their dark gray hulls and white-painted codes like frozen lines of memory. A worker passed by and nodded, the way he always did, and I nodded back. Today, I no longer belonged to this place, but it still belonged to me, at least in the way memories do. I stopped where I could see nearly the entire port. The wind pushed hard enough to puff my coat. I slipped a hand into my pocket and pulled out my father's pocket watch. The silver lid was cold enough to bite, yet somehow it steadied me. My father used to say, if you want to know what to do, choose the thing that lets you face yourself in the mirror without flinching. I opened my bag, took out my laptop, and pulled up the file I had spent so many nights preparing. The watch file. It was not just documentation. It was the answer, the witness, the thing left standing after every lie someone tried to bury. I opened each entry, reviewing it one last time. One, Caleb's internal contract, was approved and signed 2 weeks before he even submitted his official application. A document buried deep in HR folders, accessible only to high-clearance users. I found it by chance while reviewing metadata logs. 2, a payment of $7,800 labeled as temporary consulting fees, in reality an advance payout to Caleb. It had been placed under a vague miscellaneous vendor category. The approver was none other than Rick. 3, the entire onboarding process was bypassed. No welcome email, no document verification, no required training, no mandatory forms. The system logs showed Rick had granted Caleb the highest operational access with a single internal command. 4 edits to the timesheet records, where Rick modified Caleb's login times to make it appear he had been present in meetings he never attended. The system recorded every edit. Rick might be good at lying, but he could not lie to the company servers. Everything sat there neatly, lined up like metal beams stored in a cargo hold. I organized the files, compressed them into a single archive. Then I opened a temporary email account I had created a week earlier. No name, no signature, no identity needed. Only the truth, I typed. To the corporate audit team, attached are documents detailing misconduct at Redstone Maritime Logistics. Please review according to the internal procedure. I attached the entire file. For a few seconds, I did not press send. Not out of doubt, but to give myself one breath to ask whether this was revenge or simply setting the moral balance straight after someone bent it too far. Then I sent it. 2 seconds later, the soft sound of the sentence echoed like a single drop of water hitting the ocean. I turned my chair and looked at the port again. The wind pressed hard, nudging a distant ship into a slight tilt. Everything still moved. Everything still worked. But beneath the surface, the current was already changing. I deleted the temporary email account, cleared the history, and closed the laptop. The evidence now belonged to the people in New York, people who owed Rick nothing and had no reason to protect Caleb. I looked down at the pocket watch. The second hand kept moving. Steady, awake, precise. I opened the lid and let it catch a bit of the morning light. Something inside me felt lighter, as if this small piece of metal had just confirmed something I always knew but sometimes forgot. I might lose at someone else's game, but I do not lose at mine. I spoke quietly, not loud, not shaking, just enough for myself. I do not fight to win. I fight to keep the part of me that is human. The wind from the river surged again, making the pocket watch tremble lightly in my hand. I closed the lid, slipped it into my coat, and turned away from the docks. I did not know what would happen to Rick and Caleb in the days ahead, but I knew this. When the truth reaches the right hands, it does not need an escort. And that morning I walked away without looking back, not because I was cold, but because at last I knew who truly needed to. A week passed quietly, almost too quietly for someone who had just stepped away from 20 years of work. I spent my mornings at a cafe by the river, where the wind blew strongly and the air carried a faint trace of salt. No one there knew who I was, and I liked that feeling. I drank black coffee, sat at a corner table worn smooth with time, and expected nothing new from life. I only wanted a few calm days so my mind could fall back into a steady rhythm. Or at least the rhythm I used to think was steady. But the world does not move the way we want. It moves according to what we leave behind. Saturday morning, I sat in my living room with the pocket watch resting lightly in my hand. I turned on the local news like I always did. The anchor talked about the weather, then traffic, and suddenly a line scrolling across the bottom of the screen made my heart pause for a beat. Redstone Logistics is under internal investigation after an anonymous complaint. I set the watch on the table and leaned forward slightly. The anchor continued. We have received confirmation that the audit division of the parent company in New York has opened an official investigation into Redstone Maritime Logistics in Savannah regarding allegations of irregular hiring, unauthorized system access, and internal financial misconduct. A video clip appeared. The Redstone building, the same one I had walked out of days ago, now had corporate auditors stationed at the entrance. Some took notes, some made calls, others went in and out with urgent steps. I recognized a few faces: operations staff, accounting staff, people I used to greet every morning. They had been asked to wait outside while the internal systems were locked for review. I sat still. Not happy, not gloating. What I felt most clearly was the silence inside me, a kind of quiet that only people who have finally stepped out of a long fight understand. The broadcast shifted to another camera angle, this one from inside the building's lobby. 4 security officers walked beside a man in a white dress shirt, no jacket, his face drained as if someone had wiped all the color from it. Caleb Turner. He walked through the revolving door, hands empty, except for a single sheet of paper that could have been a suspension notice or a handover order. His shirt creased at the shoulders, his hair was messy, his eyes were fixed on the floor, as though looking up would make everything collapse at once. I stared at the image longer than necessary, not because I enjoyed it, but because I finally saw the truth Caleb never understood. Power cannot save someone who does not know what they are doing. Borrowed power even less. The anchor spoke again. We are told that Mr. Caleb Turner, who was appointed Director of Strategic Operations less than 2 weeks ago, has been suspended as of this morning. The next scene showed Rick Halden. He stood outside the building, being stopped by two members of the audit team. He raised his hand slightly, saying something the camera did not catch. He pointed inside, then at himself, trying to explain or blame or deny. His employee badge was removed on the spot. A commentator added, "Mr. Rick Halden, operations director, has been temporarily suspended pending investigation." Internal sources indicate signs of manipulation in hiring processes and system access approvals. I did not react. I did not smile. I did not sigh. I simply watched as if observing a ship leaving port, shrinking into the fog until it disappeared. People plant wind without imagining the day the wind returns as a storm. The program shifted to an interview segment. The guest was a maritime logistics expert, a man I recognized from a few industry conferences. Silver hair, slow, steady voice. The kind of voice people naturally listen to. The host asked, "How serious can the consequences be in a case like this?" The expert replied, "In logistics, a single bad decision by an unqualified person is not just an internal problem. It delays ships, disrupts supply chains, damages international contracts, and causes losses in the millions. Granting system access to someone without proper vetting is extremely dangerous." I sat up straighter. His tone was clear and deliberate, each word striking at the truth someone once tried to hide. Actions like altering timesheet records, granting high-level system access to someone unqualified, or issuing unverified consulting payments are serious violations. If proven, they can lead to a complete restructuring of company leadership. I watched but did not attach any emotion to the scene. I simply listened, as if hearing about a distant ship caught in a storm, a ship I no longer belonged to but understood exactly why it capsized. The news returned to a wide shot outside the Redstone building. The revolving doors spun non-stop. Employees exited. Some called on their phones. Some shook their heads. Some crossed their arms. It was organized chaos, the kind only a corporate-level audit could create. The screen froze for a moment on Caleb being escorted through the parking lot, head bowed. Then it cut to Rick, still trying to speak to the auditors, though no one cared to listen. Finally, it showed the Redstone building itself, standing silent as if waiting for its fate. I turned off the TV. The room fell quiet again, broken only by the sound of wind brushing lightly against the window. I picked up the pocket watch and opened it. The second hand kept moving, steady and unbothered by human upheaval. I sat there for several minutes, watching the second hand complete a circle, then another. Not to think about Rick, or Caleb, or Redstone. I no longer belonged there. I thought only about one thing. When the truth reaches the right place, it creates its own waves, and sometimes the undercurrents are stronger than the storms people see on the surface. I closed the watch and set it on the table with a soft breath. I do not need to speak. I do not need to prove anything. The truth is the only voice I leave behind. The news on TV was only the beginning. Big waves always start with a small tremor beneath the surface. A few days after Redstone Logistics came under investigation, stories from inside the company began leaking out exactly the way I once predicted. Quiet, unofficial, but sharp enough to tear through the curtain Rick had pulled over everything. Tuesday, my personal inbox received nearly 20 new messages. Not from the audit team, but from old coworkers, the same people who used to nod at me each morning before turning back to their screens. They wrote short notes, some only 2 words, "Thank you." Others were longer, saying the investigation had uncovered things they once suspected, but were afraid to speak about. Some said they were being interviewed and asked about Caleb. But every message shared one truth. They saw me as the person who had dropped the first stone that created the wave they needed. I read every note, then closed my laptop without replying. Not out of coldness, I simply did not want to turn what I did into a back-and-forth conversation. I did what I had to do. The rest no longer belonged to me. That afternoon, things escalated when an internal email from Redstone's HR department was leaked. A screenshot, spreading like fire on dry paper. The irony was that I was not the one who leaked it, but the truth always finds its path, even when I stay silent. The email described non-compliant hiring and unauthorized system privileges. Caleb Turner's name appeared on it, next to the bold text "temporary suspension." But that was not what caused the biggest reaction. Right beneath the leaked email, the Japan division posted an internal comment retelling the manifest incident. I imagine them typing the message with the frustration of people forced to keep a ship docked for 18 pointless hours. We had to redo the entire manifest because someone sent us a file labeled Final 2 Real XLs. No one here laughed. Just reading it, I understood the chaos they must have gone through. That small mistake had kept their whole team awake all night. And now everyone knew the issue was not the system, not the client, but Caleb, the same person who once asked me how to open Excel twice in one day. That evening, I browsed a small online forum for logistics workers. A rumor had turned into a running joke. Caleb Turner thought a pivot table was a rotating desk. Literally, I let out a soft laugh, barely more than a breath. Someone wrote that Caleb had asked where the pivot desk was located. If I had not seen his Excel skills myself, I would have thought the story was exaggerated. But I had seen enough to know it was not. A former coworker messaged me privately. Evan, people are using the word Caleb as a verb in the office. As in, do not let the system get Caleb again. I did not reply, but I understood exactly what they felt. Relief mixed with the bitter humor of old frustration was finally released. The next morning, the parent company sent an official notice. No leaks, no rumors. A clear announcement was delivered to every Redstone branch across the country. Content, senior staff purification. Objective, eliminate procedural violations and reinforce discipline and transparency. Attached was the list of positions under review, with Rick at the top. I read the notice with the same feeling as watching a ship finally admit it was taking on water from the inside, not because the waves were too strong. That afternoon, I walked past the old dock. Crane engines, ship horns, the clatter of metal, all blending into a familiar rhythm. I stood there for a while, just listening. Those sounds had been the heartbeat of my life for 20 years. And even though I had stepped away, I still felt calm returning to them. I pulled the pocket watch from my coat. Sunlight hit the face, making the second hand glow softly. I brushed my thumb over the metal lid, cold but familiar. My father once said something I remembered clearly. You can work an entire lifetime without recognition, but you only need one moment to know you did the right thing. I closed my eyes for a few seconds, then opened them again. My phone screen lit up with messages I had not read yet. Thank you for standing up. Thanks to you, everything is finally clear. You did the right thing, Evan. I did not answer. I did not delete them. I just looked at them, then locked the screen. I told myself something my father would have said if he were still alive. You did the right thing. A gust of wind came from the river, carrying the scent of salt and engine oil. I slipped the watch back into my coat pocket. Then I let out a small laugh, a brief and quiet sound, but honest. In the end, honor has its own voice. Slow, steady, but it echoes for a long time. That afternoon, I returned to the port at the hour when the sunlight sits lowest. Sunset in Savannah always has a very particular shade of gold, not bright, but soft, stretched thin like a wool scarf laid over the surface of the sea. I stood on the old wooden pier where I had watched countless ships leave and return. Strange how I used to see only work there. But today I saw more. A large crane lifted a container from a ship's deck. The cable pulled taut like a single drawn line. The last light of the day hit the steel and turned it into a glowing block suspended in midair. I watched it for a long time, almost seeing my 20 years of work reflected in that slow movement. Lifted, lowered, moved from one place to another. No one noticed how many journeys it had made, how much weather it had endured, how hard it had worked to stay whole under the pressure of metal. I exhaled slowly, not heavily, more like I was finally breathing in my own rhythm again after months of bracing against storms. 20 years, 20 years of never backing away from a shift, never allowing an error in a report, never using connections to climb a ladder. I once believed all of that would be enough to carry me to the end of my career. But I was wrong. What keeps a person standing on the right path is not the number of years. It is the ability to hold the line of their own integrity. I rested my hands on the pier railing and looked down at the scattered reflections on the water. I whispered, not loudly, just enough to hear it inside myself. I did not leave because I lost to someone. I left because I refused to lose to myself. That sentence was not a justification. It was the truth I discovered after everything that happened. Honor does not always help you keep a title, but it keeps you from losing who you are. I touched the pocket watch in my coat. I took it out and opened it again. The second hand kept moving, steady and patient, the way my father had lived his life. He never had a high title or any real power, but he had principles. That was what he left me, far more than this watch. I closed the lid gently, almost like a small ritual. I slipped it back into my coat pocket, feeling the metal rest against my chest like a reminder that I had closed a chapter without losing the part that mattered most. Below me, the waves hit the pillars with a rhythm like the heartbeat of the port. A few workers walked by and greeted me with their familiar nods. I nodded back with a small smile. No one asked why I no longer worked at Redstone. Maybe they knew. Or maybe they understood in their own way that sometimes a person has to leave to protect the part of themselves that staying would cost. I watched the sunset shift from gold to orange to violet. The last line of light stretched across the cargo boxes, pulling the crane's shadow long over the water, like a slow, deliberate cut. I thought about the people watching this story, people who have worked for years, who know what it feels like to be overlooked, ignored, or treated as if their dedication was simply expected. I thought about the hands that typed millions of numbers, the feet that stood thousands of hours on concrete floors, the people who use their strength and their decency to keep work going. I spoke softly as if speaking to those very people. If you have ever been dismissed, remember that the truth has its own way of speaking, and it speaks on its own schedule, not anyone else's. I looked back toward the foot of the pier where the last strip of sunlight stretched into a thin golden line. I understood that I had closed this chapter in the way I chose. Not loudly, not bitterly, not trying to prove anything to people who never wanted to see it. I simply let the truth do its work. I turned to leave, paused for a moment, and said one last thing meant for the people on the other side of this story, the ones watching, listening, and seeing a piece of themselves in every part of it. If this story reminded you that your voice still matters, at any age, please subscribe. I have many more stories to tell, especially for those who have spent a lifetime working with honesty. Then I walked away, leaving behind the port, the sunset, and the 20 years I had gathered into a single pocket watch. New stories will come, the way new ships always reach the pier. But today, I allowed myself to stand still for a moment and thank myself for choosing correctly, even though it cost me my departure.